Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Acharya, while explaining that how deep sleep state can lead one into bliss, also narrates bliss is something which can be experienced even in a waking state. We saw the example of ghee yesterday. Ghee in a solid state melts, and once it's cool, becomes solidified again. Likewise, the mind and the intellect melts into Anandamaya Kosha during deep sleep and solidifies again once we get into the waking state. It becomes the Vijnanamaya Kosha and then travels into the dream state, and finally we get up awake. Brahman, which is conscious self, head to foot in a jiva, appears in three places. During deep sleep, in the lotus heart. During the dream state, in the neck. And during the waking state, through the eyes. And all of us experience three states. The three states are state of happiness, state of misery, and state of indifference. We have a fair idea of what is state of happiness and what is state of misery. The indifference is a state in between the two. Small pocket windows when we actually feel nice. We actually feel we will be in a state, even during the waking stage, that we will neither be sorrowful nor feel very happy. We will feel nice. So this is a state of indifference, which Vedanta calls, it is not actual bliss, but a flavor of a bliss. It's a flavor. So what is the difference? Water is in a vessel, but the coolness of it can be felt even outside the vessel by touching it, because coolness is its nature. So likewise, through the small windows, we start enjoying nice moments. And Vedanta explains it, why this indifference? Those moments when we experience that nice feeling will be moments where our ego will not be dominating over us. We can't say that we have reached an egoless state, but nevertheless there are many occasions where the ego is either subdued or fractionally absent, and this nice feeling props at those moments. And Vedanta says, if you keep increasing it, if ego proportionately starts reducing, then these moments start increasing. They are directly proportionate to each other and would eventually lead one to slowly withdraw, because he will start feeling nice more and more. He will feel quiet. He will enjoy solitude and would develop the mind to withdraw. The only caution Vedanta seeks to utter at this juncture is, one should not be impatient or feel disgusted or dejected, thinking that either the process is slow or the process is not yielding results. And gives an important illustration. A sparrow laid few of its eggs on a nearby ocean, and it was meticulously trying to retrieve those eggs from the ocean. And what did it do? It used its small bill to pick what little drops of water it can and started to put it over the sand. Garuda watched this and was moved by the perseverance of the small sparrow. Divine Garuda, using the divine power, started to flap its wings and ensured that place where the eggs were to be found becomes dry and enabled the sparrow to take it. Vedanta seeks to drive home a very important point. If there is sincerity in our pursuit, divine grace and divine guidance of a guru will appear in front of us and initiate us, handhold us, and take us forward. It's all ultimately a mind game, says Acharya. Because what is samsara? Mind alone is samsara. It must be purified with great effort. Of what mind a man is, so does he become. This is the eternal secret, says Acharya. By the clarification of the mind, one certainly destroys karma, good and bad. With a clear mind and steadied self, he attains the never waning happiness. Mind alone is the cause of bondage and release of men. It is stated that it leads to bondage when attached to objects and to release when unattached to objects. So Vedanta says, capture these momentary feelings, start recording it, watch it carefully and follow it. These momentary feelings, if we start pursuing it and watching it, it will lead us into intense faith. And intense faith in turn leads us to better determination. And once the determination becomes strong, then the flavor of bliss slowly transforms into the experience of bliss itself. As we progress, we will not only avoid pain from life, we will also try to avoid pleasures. It's a very important direction which Vedanta guides each one of us into. As you progress in this journey, you will want to give up pain actively and we will attempt to do that. But in the process, we will also attempt to give pleasures. In fact, Vedanta gives an interesting example. Somebody wants to self-immolate. Will he or she be interested to dress themselves well and put on the best jewels before self-immolating? Nobody will do that. So, pleasures will also get discarded along with pain. When any cause of sorrow happens, he or she will not be affected as before. Because of this gradual movement in life, one will have the dual sensation. Like one is capable of perceiving the sense of coldness and that of heat. We will be able to perceive the duality of both. And once we reach this critical stage, then we will slowly be soaking ourselves, getting dragged into the journey towards realization. And the more we start traveling, the intensity and the density of our ego will start diminishing, thinning, and finally sinking, giving us the opportunity to experience bliss. With this, we come to the closure of chapter 11. Let's see chapter 12 tomorrow. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Chapter 11 gave us the guidance of the bliss of Brahman in our dream state and also in our waking state, and provided the guidance how through proper concentration one can cognize and assimilate it. Acharya continues the same subject, bliss of Brahman, again in chapter 12. But this time, he conveys and guides us how one can feel the bliss of Brahman even in our ordinary routine lives, even though many of us don't cognize it. He gives us a lot of illustrations. They are important because at the end of it, the message that is sought to be conveyed is ask the question. After knowing all these illustrations, find out whom do you love the most. That answer and that assimilation will help us a lot, is what Acharya says. Now, what are the illustrations? These are illustrations given by Yajnavalkya while teaching his wife Maitreyi, and this is found in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads. Between a husband and wife relationship, because that's considered to be the strongest bond in material life, even though it is mutual, find out carefully, why do we love our wife, or why does our wife love us so much? Ask this question. Intricately, one will finally come to a conclusion: more than pleasing one's wife, it is ultimately the individual who likes it and therefore parts with that love. May it be husband, may it be wife, may it be mutual, may it be everlasting, let it be anything. But the bottom line truth, according to Yajnavalkya, is you love more because it gives you happiness to yourself. And therefore you do that love. When you are uncomfortable, when you are ill, when you are sick, you don't do it at all. Or you do it partially, or you do it with irritation. So it depends on you, is the first fact or the illustration given. Now, if we continue with the same illustration, same set of examples, let's take a grandfather hugging his grandchild and the mustache scratching the soft, tender skin of the grandchild. It irritates the grandchild, but the grandfather still does it because it gives him the pleasure. Let's take precious stones lying on one's table. Happiness arising out of it is for the stone or for the individual. Let's take a bull carrying cartload of things and the owner trying to be very soft and kind towards the bull. Is it for the good upkeep of the bull or to ensure that his cartloads are delivered safely in the destination required? Take Swargaloka, take Brahmaloka. One does enough penance, enough rituals, and aspires for these benefits. Does it go to benefit these lokas or does it benefit the individual? All of us keep praying to gods, various deities, various pariharas, all to eradicate our own sins, because sinless gods do not need them. So is it for the benefit of the gods or the deities or for oneself? One who is blessed to learn the Vedas wants to somehow learn it, somehow not deviate it. Is it for the benefit of the Vedas or for the individual? Let's take the 5 elements. Each one of them provide us something very precious. Earth provides us residence. Water quenches our thirst. Fire helps us to perform various things, cooking, drying, rituals, etc. Wind provides a soft breeze, drying, and space, of course, gives us the advantage of enjoying objects all over the universe. Ask the question, do these benefit those elements or the individuals who enjoy it? Take the case of a master and servant relationship. The master cajoles the servant for servant's benefit or for master's benefit. The servant tries to do his best to the master and wants to please him always. Is it for the master's benefit or for the servant's benefit? We can keep adding the list, says Vedanta. But the bottom line is, please impregnate the following truths in your mind. 1. Whenever you interact with the world, keep constantly remembering the fact you do it because you want to enjoy it. You want to derive happiness. Let this get imprinted in the mind. It's for our own happiness. In fact, the cluster of illustrations shows what? It shows we have great love towards object. We have faith and trust towards relationship. Devotion towards gods and gurus. And inexhaustible desires over things which had not been obtained. This is our state of mind. So, amidst all these illustrations, what is the underlying truth that we need to capture? 1. We love ourselves the most. That's an undeniable fact. And why do we love ourselves the most? Simply because we are Brahman. Simply because we are bliss. And therefore, this joy or love for ourselves occurs in spite of objects, occurs through objects, occurs even when the objects or relationship or devotion is absent. It is so consistent. It's never unsteady and it never ever deviates from us. Because self is incapable of being abandoned or being wound up. Can one's own affection wander? Because it is not something which is outside us. Mind wanders, even though mind is part of the koshas, but bliss doesn't wander. That's the difference between bliss and mind. So, the strength, the inherent strength of every jiva is it loves its himself or herself the most. Of course, a question is raised by the objection is, if you say you love the most, why are people committing suicide? Vedanta replies spontaneously. Who is he killing? Or who is she killing in the process of a suicide? It's the body that is getting killed, not the Atma. You want to throw away your body, suicide is a process. You can never throw away the Atma because it travels beyond the body. Therefore, suicide is not an exception even to say that you don't love you the most, says Vedanta. Let's continue tomorrow. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. We saw yesterday various illustrations and finally the guidance by Acharya confirming the fact all these illustrations go to prove that we love our own self the most. So, two things are evident. Self is the most dear, and oneself can experience it patently. and it is confirmed by authority, reasoning, and also experience. However, people relying on the Vedas and the Upanishads confront Vedantis with some questions. They say, don't you know, Upanishad says, Vedas says, Sun is Atma. One's own son is Atma. If somebody does not get a son, then that birth is a waste. It becomes sinful. Various quotations are relied upon. And therefore they say, when Vedas and Upanishads say sun is an Atma, now you are saying your own self is an Atma. What does it mean? So, Vedanta explains it beautifully. It says, at no point of time have a mistake. Brahman is always self, and self is always standalone truth. But these are all referred to for what purposes? And this Atmahood, which we all believe it, is therefore classified broadly into three categories by a Vedanta. As derivative Atma, as false Atma, and primary Atma. Because these are the three broad buckets in which most of the transactions will fall. Take, for example, derivative Atma. This Devadatta is verily a line. A statement made about a proud claim about one's own son. So the selfhood of the son here becomes prominent. And therefore it is called the derivative Atma. Most of us or all of us tend to believe that Atma resides only in the five koshas. It could be body, it could be mind, it could be buddhi. So such a misconception, Vedanta calls it as false Atma. When somebody says Atma is a pure witness, untouched, then that is the right understanding and therefore called as primary Atma. But in our day-to-day routines, Atmahood is something which becomes very relative, and these positions keep changing based on circumstances. That's what Vedanta seeks to say. And it gives some examples. Suppose the father, a man is about to die, that Jiva is about to depart. Now, whether that Jiva is the principal Atma, primary Atma at the moment, it may not be, because it is departing. Does the body become the primary Atma? No, because that corpse is going to fall down flat once it is dead. There, the son who takes over the interest of the family becomes primary there. And therefore, Vedas scriptures from that perspective seek to make such statements. That son is verily the Atma. Therefore, same thing. This student is like a fire. Now, there is a student, there is also a fire nearby. This reference of fire is not to the fire because it doesn't have the competence of being a student. Therefore, the reference is only to the student in terms of his capability. A Jiva says, I want to do penance, I want to do rituals, I want to reach heaven. Here, the Atma is actually the Jiva, contextually, because it is the Jiva which is craving for higher positions in life. And finally, somebody says, I'm waiting for an opportunity. I want to may a divine emancipated Guru come into my life. May he guide me. May I be released from bondage. Here, Atmahood is relatable to one's own conscious, blemishless, blissful, changeless self. So, contextual reference should not be mistaken. Atmahood is variously assigned according to the several standpoints from which each of us as aspirants look at it. That's exactly what Vedanta says. And as we look at it, we broadly try to classify this Atmahood into 4 categories based on a priority. The one with whom we are most attached becomes the dearest or greatest affection. It could be one's son, it could be one's wife, it could be one's money. So it varies from in jiva to jiva. What you are wedded to in material life gives the greatest affection to you, because ultimately it is in the sense you are satisfied, your self is satisfied, therefore you are posing the greatest affection. It attracts you towards that, and therefore it becomes the greatest affection. Then what is of lesser importance and interest but still relevant to you becomes ordinary affection. Between supreme affection and ordinary affection, the degree varies based on our interest over things. Then 2 more aspects also appear as part of our life. Something which we disregard and something which is hateful. You can classify the relationship, our association with objects or persons or relationship, etc., into any one of the 4 categories. That which appeals to us as the greatest, that appeals to us as ordinary, that which is disregardable, and that which is hateful. If a tiger appears before us suddenly, then we will hate to see it. So that will fall under the category of hateful. But if the same tiger does not come forward or pounce on us, it is looking at a different direction and walking away from us, then we keep disregarding. If the same tiger, with the help of a trainer, gets trained and it is very friendly with you, you may develop either an ordinary affection or even a supreme affection, depending upon your relationship with the tiger. Therefore, hate, disregard, ordinary and supreme affection varies from person to person, occasion to occasion, and circumstances to circumstances. The Atma is most dear, but let's remember the formula. Atma is most dear. What is subservient to it is dear. And after that comes hatefulness and disregard. Let's continue tomorrow.